Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another V-Ray and Maya tutorial. Today, I kind of want to go over some production techniques, some stuff that you'll use that any good lighter V-Ray V-Ray person should know. Excuse me. All right, so I've got this scene here. This is what the render looks like. You know, it's nothing too exciting. Here, I'll just full screen that. And of course, my full screen is way bigger than my viewable area. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so this is the scene. It's nothing special. You know, just something that we can work with to do some render pass stuff. So I'm gonna scale this down a little bit. I just slapped this together this morning, so bear with me. I just wanted something with some different objects that we could use. All right, cool. So that's that. Just tuck that out of the way. And here's what the scene looks like. There's a bunch of lights in here. There doesn't really need to be this many lights in here. I just kind of got carried away, which happens. So basically what these lights are doing, I can just really quickly go over it, and I'll go over it with this open and off to the side here. So this top light here, it's just actually providing some spec rim lighting. So on the tops of all these different brick surfaces, you're getting you're just getting that specular hit right there. And if I turn that off, we lose all that, and then the wall looks a lot more flat. Same kind of thing over here. These two little filler lights, just providing this sort of global, or not global, but rather local kind of rich, warm tone here, and with nice specular highlights that are kind of warmly tinted here. And then same thing on the other side, just sort of like a light. I mean, that could be from anything. It could be like we're in a shadow here from a cloud, and like this is where the moonlight's fully, truly coming through. I mean, you know, you can use your imagination. It just provides a little balance or a little contrast on this otherwise blank, flat wall that would be rather boring. So just areas where, you know, we're in shadow or in light, you know, etc. Just helps to break up that wall. I mean, you can already see, like right here, the grass in the center. This is looking pretty boring and flat. It'd be nice to get like a big shadow kind of across, or like maybe even another light streak right here, and have this guy be in light, which would be kind of fun. But I'm not going to do that right now. Right now, I'm just going to be focusing on setting up some passes. But just to finalize and show you guys, like, you know, what the other lights are doing here. There is just an omni light, a sphere light right here in the scene, and that is, you know, our camp light here. And then I'm also boosting in a bit more. Here, if we scoot that over, a bit more of this moonlight. So you'll see my values at about 0.4, kind of a bluish color, and I'm just sort of like giving this rim look around his head and shoulders. This light, I believe, is a firelight adder. Yep. So this is adding in a little more firelight. So this is getting that little orange glow. We should be getting, you know, a lot of good light from our omni light here, or our sphere light, excuse me. But it wasn't enough, and it wasn't really hitting the rim of the character where I wanted it to. So I just threw in another one, and using that. Same kind of thing over here. Here's another warm light being cast from the right side of the character. And again, this is just to add a little bit of visual interest. I mean, if you think about it, this wall probably has sconces, you know, every 10 meters or something, or 30 meters or whatever. So I'm just throwing in a bit more warm light from the right side of the frame, because there would probably be another sconce off to the right of the frame somewhere. And always when you're mixing blues and golds and blues and, you know, yellows and stuff, you get these really nice sort of purpley tones coming in. So I always try to look for opportunities to throw in some of those purpley values, but not actually putting purple in the scene, but just letting the blue and gold sort of blend to give us those sort of warm cools, I guess you could call them. All right, so cool. That's that. And the grass in the scene here is just it's V-Ray fur. It's nothing special. I literally just selected the plane and created V-Ray fur. So just go to create V-Ray, and then V-Ray fur, and add V-Ray fur to selection. Pretty standard stuff. I put the same shader that's on this ground on the fur, just so you get, you know, the same color of stuff. So nothing crazy there. V-Ray fur is insanely easy to work with. You can assign shaders to it. All the values are really fun to play around with. So that's really fun. I rigged these characters. I modeled and rigged these characters in Maya using Advanced Skeleton 2, which is a super handy plugin for doing rigs. And I can just show you really quickly. If I just go here to the character warrior, if I turn off these two and go back to his rigged version, you can see I do have controllers. Let me see if I have them. I do have controllers, but I don't know where they are. But you can kind of see, you know, I'm not a rigger by a long shot, but it's just interesting how fast, you know, I just drop a skeleton on and then define these like locations. You got to play with it. You got to see what's going on there. It's pretty impressive. But anyway, Advanced Skeleton. So I'll unhide these again. And let's get the scene ready for render. So you'll see right off the bat that I have no render layers, no render elements, nothing crazy going on. If I go to the render layers, it's just a master layer. So what we're gonna do is start adding in some. So this is how I would basically approach any production job. If this is where I was, and they're like, the client's like, we love it, it's perfect. Which obviously the client would never say to this, but this is what I would do next. So first thing, open up render elements and add all these guys in here. So we're gonna want to diffuse, extra text, lighting, normals, reflection. There's a tail in the way, specular, z depth. Those are the basic ones I will add. Let's see, and I always do 2 extra texts. One, and I just click over here, go to the attribute editor, and V-Ray attributes, extra V-Ray attributes. Go to texture, and I'm just going to turn on V-Ray dirt. V-Ray dirt is V-Ray's version of an occlusion pass. Always with my V-Ray dirts, I click on these 2 checkboxes, double-sided and work with transparency. Double-sided just make sure that any back faces will still occlude correctly, and work with transparency. That's really useful for like lights that are close to geometry. Those lights will still show up in the occlusion pass, you know, if they're really close to geometry, even if the light is invisible. So what that work with transparency does is it just makes sure that if the light's invisible, it's not going to show up on the occlusion pass. I also always turn up my samples to 32 because 8 just never seems to be enough. It's always going to be a grainy occlusion pass. So next extra text I would set up as a V-Ray Fresnel pass. So right there, V-Ray Fresnel. I just leave it at the default settings. Just a really useful pass for shaping out your edge highlighting here and there. You know, you can really paint that in certain places, and it's just going to add a lot of visual interest to the scene. So that's, and I'll show you guys that. I'll do a little bit of compositing on this as well in Photoshop, just so you guys can see how I use some of these passes. Okay, so those are the basic ones I would add. For this situation, I've got some bump mapping going on, so I'm also going to add a bump normals. I don't use the bump normals too often. I don't even really use the normals too often, but they're really useful passes actually just for checking stuff, because if you render with the normals, you'll be able to see really quickly and clearly what faces are inverted. And inverted faces are generally a bad idea because they're not going to pick up reflections right, they're not going to bounce GI right. You can make them do all that stuff correctly, but it's just going to throw, it has to be a global thing. So your whole scene now is going to be calculating reflections for the backsides of objects as well as GI for the backsides of objects. It's just unnecessary. So ideally you always want to make sure your faces are facing the right way. So moving on really quickly. I'm going to add some multi-mats. I'm going to put in, let's just say 3. Just looking at the scene and how much stuff is in here, I think 3 multi-mats will probably be enough. Because inside of each multi-mat, we get 3 channels. So we get an R, G, and B. So that's 9 different channels that we're going to use here. And I'm just looking at the materials, and we probably have about 9 materials. All right, so I'll set up these multi-mats by just going over here and clicking on Consider for Anti-Aliasing. And the reason I turn that on is Vray will calculate its aliasing based on how much light is hitting that object. So if there's a whole ton of light hitting that object, it's going to calculate the aliasing really fast and easy. It's going to need very few samples, and it's going to be beautiful, clean edges. If Vray doesn't have enough light, if there isn't enough light hitting an object, or say for example you're doing a matte only pass and you just turn off all the lights so it renders faster, Vray's not going to know that it needs to sample those edges because they're so dark, they're in shadow, you can't really distinguish one edge from another. So Vray's just like, oh, we don't need to worry about that, and it's just going to ignore it. When you click on this Consider for Anti-Aliasing, the anti-aliasing sampler will always go through and clean up your edges, no matter how much light is in the scene or not. So really useful to leave that on always. I just always leave it on. It's just it should be defaulted on, I feel like. And then also I'm going to turn on the Use Material IDs. So there's 2 ways of doing mats inside of Vray. There's Material IDs and there's Object IDs. Material IDs are when you assign your materials an ID color. I mean, it's pretty, that makes sense. Object IDs are where you assign it onto a polysurface or onto a Vray object properties group. And I'll go into both methods because they're both useful, just different situations. So I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3 here for my red, green, and blue for my multi-mat 0. For multi-mat 1, I'm going to do 4, 5, and 6. And what this means is I'm just assigning, I'm going to be going through and assigning numbers onto the different materials in my scene. And those numbers are going to correspond with my multi-mat setups over here. So for example, if I end up making this, and I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but if I end up making this brick texture material, number 5 on my multi-mat ID, that means when I render the scene, if I go to this multi-mat 1 render layer, or sorry, render element, I will see all these bricks as green because my green object is number 5. And I'll just show you guys because that's going to make more sense. So, all right, render settings are good to go for the moment. And let's just add some multi-mats to stuff. So I'm going to scoot this over here, get this out of the way, and we're going to pull up our hypershade. All right, here we are. Turn off this stupid material viewer because I think it's just a big piece of junk. I mean, the whole, yeah, I mean, don't get me started on V-Ray. Or sorry, Maya 2016's hypershade. They completely did away with the system that worked so well and replaced it with this node editor. And the node editor is total BS. I really don't like it. I just wish they had an option to go back to the legacy thing. Such a shame. All right, so what I'm going to do now is quickly go through my scene and just select the different objects that have a different material. So I know all these guys are all sharing the same material. I know all the blades all have the same material on them. And you can always double check that if you just, select the blade, for example, graph it, and then hold on right click and go to select objects with material. And you can see, yeah, all those blades have the same material. So I already know that, and you can kind of see in the scene that like these are all sharing the same material. The dudes are all sharing the same material. The blades are, and so are the hilts. And lastly, the handle. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 materials. Wow. Oh, 6. Let's do the grass too. Okay. So I'm going to graph all of them. And let's just start assigning some material IDs to these things. So this is our hilt. Let's actually rename it. Hilt SHD. And I throw oops. I throw the SHD on there when I'm working on personal projects. You don't really need to when you're working in production because people are pretty good about naming things and then you get a bunch of references and stuff. But if, for example, if I had just named that hilt as the geometry and then just renamed this shader to hilt, it'll put the 1 at the end of it, and then it just gets weird. Like, well, which one's my shader? Which one's my geo? If you're looking at a list, it's just easier to throw the SHD at the end. So this guy will be skin SHD. That way it forces it, defines it as a shader. Ay. I have a new mouse here, and it's has an issue with holding down middle click. It wants to scroll also. All right, so I think this is my brick wall. SHD. Cool. This is the blades. Blade SHD. And finally, I think this is our grip SHD. Okay, cool. Oh, there's one more. What did I skip? That's our grass. Grass SHD. All right. So now that we got that sorted out, I'll go to my hilt, and it doesn't matter what order I do this in, as long as it stays consistent between all my scenes. But if I do it once, then any scene I generate off of this one is going to be fine. So let's go to hilt, attributes, Vray, material ID, scroll to the bottom, and you get this extra Vray attributes tab now. I'm just going to assign this number 1. Skin SHD, Vray, material ID, scroll down, and this is going to be number 2. Brick wall, attributes, Vray, material ID, number 3. Now this process, if you have a lot of materials in your scene, can be rather exhausting. But I have very few materials, so it's really not a big deal. Even if you have a ton of materials, you can kind of see how fast it goes. That's number 5. And lastly, we have number 6. So even if I have 50 materials or 70 materials in the scene, I'll just lay them all out in here and just work my way from left to right, assigning numbers. Now the numbers are a little bit haphazard when it comes into actually into the scene. You can of course be more conscious about that. So for example, I could have made this 1, this 2, and that 3, which is always useful. And then, like the grass and the wall could be part of another multi-mat set, and the character could be part of another multi-mat set. But, it's not really all that necessary, because, what you're going to be doing is probably doing a layer contact sheet, spreading this stuff all out inside a nuke, and then going to town. So you're going to see where your multi-mats are pretty easily. And it's very quick to check through them. But okay, so now that we have material IDs on the characters, and we have our material IDs set up here, I'm just going to do another quick render. 25% resolution. And here we go. So let me just get this back onto our main camera, our main view. Great. Okay, so this is only 25% now, just because there's no point in making everybody wait for 3 minutes when they can only wait for a minute. Okay, so this is coming out. I always like to leave that on. Okay, should be pretty fast here. Not as fast as I want it though. All right, well, we can at least start checking through our passes right now. So there's our alpha, of course. Our diffuse pass is just the color with no lighting. Occlusion, you can see how beautiful and smooth that looks. There's no graininess at all. That's because we bumped our subdivs up to 32. We've got our lighting pass, normals pass. Now what the normals are really used for mostly is relighting things inside of Nuke or After Effects. So you can load in a normals pass, and there's a plugin called Normality, which allows you to position 3D lights inside of After Effects. And then because the normal is essentially information of the object space in 3D, the object in 3D space. So for example, like the way this works is red light is coming from the left, green light is coming from the top, and blue light's coming from the straight forward. And then the computer can look at that and say, oh, well, red is over here and green's up here, so if I put a light here, it's just going to calculate my red and green mix up and be able to essentially relight this scene. It would make sense if I showed you. But the normals it's a pretty powerful pass. I just don't really use it that often because I'm a lighter, so I do my lighting in Maya. Reflection pass, pretty nice. Specular pass, combination of the lighting and the specular highlights, and our Z depth. And then here is our Fresnel pass, one of our extra texts we added. And you can see it's just useful for like rim lighting on stuff. And then what else do we got? Bump normals. So we have a bump map on this back wall. It's not really showing up that well, but that's why that's coming up in the bump normals. And then here's our multimats that we just set up. So our back wall, on multimat 1, if I go over back here and look for my brick wall, I click this guy and scroll down, it's multimat number 3. And if I open up my render globals again, if I go to the multimat, which is what we're looking at, multimat 1, number 3 is blue. And you can see here, our back wall is blue. Number 1 is green, and number 2 is red. And our red is our hilt. So if I look over here for my hilts, I should see a number 1. And there is our number 1 right there. So that's kind of how those work. And if I scroll down to multimat 1, you can see the other parts. And our grass is kind of be included by our actual V-Ray fur. And I think for setting up V-Ray fur, you can't just do a material ID for it. You have to do an object ID based mat. So let's make our multimat 3. Instead of use material IDs, we'll make this use object IDs by just checking that off. And when you're using object IDs, you don't need to continue on the 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, etc. You can start over again. So we'll go 1, 2, 3. Oops. 1, 2, 3 again. Cool. And let's set up some multimats, or some object ID multimats. All right. So looking at this again, I have this character, and I'm probably going to want to color correct him separately from these guys. But I'm going to want to color correct him. I mean, right now in Photoshop, I could just cut out this section and pull the green channel out, and then I've got a mat of this guy alone. But let's say I want a mat of his sword, his hilt, his character, and all that stuff all in one mat. Now, I could construct that, taking the red and green from this one and the red and green from this one and mix them all together and then create a whole mat for the guy. But that's kind of a pain in the butt. And let's say, for example, I wanted this guy in the back here. Well, he's kind of stacked up on top of this guy in the front. And so I can't just really like lasso him away. I mean, I could, but it's going to be a little bit messy. And what if this was an animation? Like, that's just going to be a ton of work for someone to roto. So let's separate these guys out as main characters, or as different characters. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to get this out of the way. And this is super fun. I'm going to take all the parts of him and deselect that. And I'm just going to go up here to create V-Ray object properties. Single object properties, no deselection. And you'll see it added this V-Ray object properties group down here. So I'm just going to double click this and do VROP for V-Ray object properties. And then I'm going to type in enemy, oops, 01. Okay, so I'm going to click this now. And over here, you'll see on the V-Ray object properties, you get a bunch of really cool tools that are great for compositing and render layer setup. We're going to be using these a lot. I'm going to click on this override object ID, and I'm going to set this to number 1. So now everything that's in this object properties group is going to get red in that multi-mat that I have for object properties. So I'll do the same thing for this guy over here. Select all of him, create V-Ray object properties, VROP enemy 02, select that, override to number 2. And last but not least, or actually, well, last but not least of the enemies, so stop to our hero, V-Ray object properties, single object properties group, VROP enemy 03. And the cool thing about these object properties is they don't affect anything that's happening in this hierarchy. So, you know, I can add all sorts of crazy things from different parts of these groups, and it's not going to screw up anything in this hierarchy. It's just going to add them to this group also, or remove them from this group also. And then I can also twirl it down and see what's in it, really easily. I can drag stuff. I can middle click and drag stuff into that. If I want to get them out, like if I wanted to remove, say, this character body from it, the easiest way, you can't really drag it out because it's not dragging out to anywhere. But the easiest way to do it is select your object you want to get rid of and then go to Create, Vray, Object Properties, and then Remove Object Properties from Selection. That's the easiest way. So I'm not going to do that because I want them in there. And then lastly, I'm going to do the same thing to our hero guy. Create, Vray, Object Properties, Single Node, Vrop, and Hero. And we got an error down there. That's basically just saying that it will not allow me to add the lights for his eyes, which are actually up here, and I forgot about them, into the Object Properties group. Object Properties groups only accept geometry. They'll take a group as well, but I would highly recommend against putting groups in your Object Properties groups, mainly because as stuff changes, like as geometry changes, as things get added to new groups, especially if you're working in a production pipeline. I mean, if you're the only one working on this stuff, then you're going to have a better understanding about what's coming in through animation, what's coming into the pipeline. But if you're working in a large group with a bunch of other people, and one guy's animating, or a bunch of guys are animating, etc., and some guys doing scene layout still, like he's going to be changing the stuff that's inside of those groups all the time. So if you just put the whole group in there, all of a sudden you may end up with the total wrong stuff being matted out. So what I like to do is just throw all the geo as it is at the base level into the groups, because I have a lot more control over where it is, what it is, and all that stuff. Now that's not always the case, because there are certain situations where I would want to throw a group in, but I can talk about that as we go. So there's our hero in a group now, and let's just make sure he's got an object ID. So he's going to be number 4, and I forgot to set our third guy to number 3. Second guy, third guy, awesome. Okay, and then we'll just also do one for our grass. So if I just select the grass and this bottom plane, I'll just go up here to Create, Vray, Object Properties, Single Object Properties, Vrop, Grass. Cool. And lastly, click that on, number 5. Okie dokie. Where's my thing? Cool, here it is. So you'll notice that I made a few more than I have available. So I have 1, 2, and 3 object properties IDs, and then I also have a 4 and a 5. Now I haven't made a 4 and a 5 render layer yet, or multi-mat, so I'll go ahead and do that. Just select multi-mat again, add another one, consider for anti-aliasing, and I'll do 4, 5, 6, and make sure that use material IDs is still checked off. So I have 2 use material IDs ones, and here, let's go ahead and change these names. So there's a few ways you can change the name of this stuff. You can go in here and change it here, but I think that the easiest way is to change it up here, because it seems to change it everywhere better. So we'll do this Vray mat 01. So that means it's just, and then we can change the name here, is mat 01. And mat for material ID. So this will be mat 02. And I'll just copy this, mat 02. And then here, this one will be Vray obj 01. And this will be obj 02. And then right here we'll do obj 01. Just copy and paste that, 02. All right. So that is basically setting up our multi-mats. And let's just do a real quick render so we can see the extra effect that we've had now. So now what we should have is a pretty full coverage on our mats. Not only do we have multi-mats for every individual shader in the scene, we're also going to have multi-mats for each character as a whole, and our backgrounds and all that stuff. So as we just get a little bit more of this thing rendered out, I can show you guys. Scroll down here. So our occlusion pass, our lighting pass. Now we included those little eye lights that I totally forgot to have in there last time. And so here's our multi-mats, and you can see the new name we added, MMMat01. It's taking the name that I have here, not the name I made up here. So inside of render globals, it's still called Vray RE for Vray render element, multimat mat01. But down here, my file name suffix, and this is what the compositors are going to see, is mmmat01. So you can leave all these as material ID or multimat, whatever. Nobody's ever going to see that except for you or anybody else who opens the scene file. Just useful to know. Excuse me. All right. And then we've got our object IDs. And you can see as these are coming out, we have this entire character as red, including his sword and his hilt and all that stuff. This character over here is going to be all green, and the one behind him is going to be all blue. And you may be saying to yourself, oh, okay, cool, so they're solid red, green, and blue. What good does that do me? Well, I'll show you guys in a minute. I'll just bring this into Photoshop really quickly so you guys can see how to extract this stuff using Photoshop, and I'll also bring it into Nuke so you guys can see how to extract this stuff using Nuke. I can even do it in After Effects. I probably will, because those are the three main compositing softwares, but I'll do that in the next tutorial, because this one's supposed to be about getting scene setups and render elements and things. All right, cool. So there you go. You can kind of see he's still being included by the grass, and all that stuff is still working. Now these guys are separated from each other, so if I had animation, I could color correct this one completely separately from this one, and it would work great. And then and then multimat object 2, we've got our main hero, and then we have all the grass as with the full V-Ray fur, everything. Cool. So yeah, that's like ready to rock and roll and start doing some pretty good compositing on. So next, let's set up some render layers. So render layers are super helpful. Obviously, that's kind of an obvious statement. But what I like to do with them is always create a blank one. Now, there's a lot of different debate over what's the best way to set up render layers. From my experience, the best way to set up your render layers is to set them up blank and then set them up as global layers. I'll explain why. So we've got this new one. I'm just going to call it Beauty, or BTY for Beauty. Now what you can do is you can write, well, okay, so just to back up real fast, I can either create a layer by just selecting a few of these things. Let's just grab those guys alone. And I'm going to do a new render layer from selection. And if I go to that new render layer, you're going to see just those guys. Now those guys are the only things that live in this render layer. I can add a bunch more geometry, I can add a bunch more lights, I can add all sorts of stuff, but this render layer will still only ever contain these 4 dudes. That can be helpful, but it can also be a huge detriment because it's very typical, it's very easy to forget when new things are added to add those new things back into the render layer that you want to have affecting them. So I don't really like to do it that way because when you're in production, you're working on 20 scenes and animation gets updated and they threw in a bunch of new geometry. It's never going to show up in your render layers until you add it, and you're gonna forget. You're gonna do the whole render, and someone's gonna get mad at you because they're like, "Hey, I spent 2 days putting that stuff in there. It's not in the render." You're like, "Ah, shit, sorry." So set them up always as global. It's also cleaner and it's way less likely to break your scene. So for example, if I had those 4 guys in that one render layer, and then all of a sudden the animator was like, "Oh, we don't need that guy anymore," and deleted him, there's a possibility, and it depends on a lot of factors that are super crazy. I don't even know them all, but there's a possibility that that render layer will now break because it's looking for an object to throw into it that it doesn't have anymore. Like, it's not even in the scene anymore, it's gone. So it's like, hey, yo, what's the deal? I'm missing something. And you'll end up getting these things called, RN foster node or foster parent. And what that is, just a reference node. And we have an object that doesn't have a parent anymore, that doesn't have a group that it lives in anymore, but it's still being asked for by our render layers. So there's like a tag left over that's just sort of waiting for that object to come back to existence so that it knows where to put it. It gets messy. So to avoid all the mess and all the headache and all the everything, just do it this way. Save you so much effort. Beauty. If I right click on this now, go to attributes in my attribute editor, I can click on this global button. And that basically makes it just like your master layer. So now our beauty and our master layer are exactly identical. Another really important thing to know when you're working with render layers is anything you do to the master layer is going to be affected, or is going to affect all other render layers that you have. So let's just pretend like we have two. So I'll make this one mats, for example. Right click, attributes, global. So in our master layer, let's say we hide this guy. I'm just going to show him. So we just hide him. Now, because these are both global render layers, if I go to my beauty or my mats, the dude's hidden in both of them. Now, let's unhide him and then go to our beauty and hide him there. Now, if I go back to my master layer, he's still there, he's still visible, but in my beauty layer, he's now hidden. Although in my mats layer, he's unhidden again. He's just like he is on my master layer. So let's just unhide him here. Go back to our master layer and hide him there. And you'll see what happened is now he should be hidden now because I'm hiding him on the master layer. The beauty layer, he should be hidden here. He's still hidden on the mats. So the reason why he's not is because I now have an invisible override. And I say invisible because this is going to bite you in the butt more often than it's not. But I have an invisible override here that's forcing this guy to be on because I forced him to be on in the beauty layer. But my master layer, I turned him off. But in my beauty layer, he's still forced on. So that's kind of a thing that you always got to be mindful of. These guys are going to pop on and off whenever they want. And there is a way I know to fix that once you've done it. But, okay, so here's how I would fix this. If I was in production and I was rushing and I had very little time and I needed to make sure that this guy was always going to respect whatever the animator had done initially, go back to my master layer, go to my reference editor, and I think these guys, oh, well, crap. Okay, so these aren't references anymore. If they were references, you could turn off the reference, right click on the thing, go to File, List Reference Edits, and it would bring a whole list of all the things that you've done to this character in your lighting scene. And you could find the one that said primary visibility, and you could just delete that that node. But because I actually had these guys living in the scene, they're really, the best way to do it is just to find him on the master layer and then fix him on the beauty layer. So what I mean is, like, on the master layer, okay, well, there's the guy. In the beauty layer, he's still hidden. I can just go back here and force, re-unhide him. Anyway, that kind of got a little complicated. Working with render layers is a little complicated. It requires a lot of, like, thinking. Okay, well, moving along. So our mats layer. So anyway, basically beauty, I would kind of have it always mimic exactly what's going on in the master layer. So whatever was happening here, I would want my beauty to be the same. And that way I treat my master layer as a beauty layer. And my beauty layer is just throwing the name BTY on my render layers, on my output images. So mats are one of those kind of funky layers. So if I need to set up a mat pass, so for example, I need to render this scene, but it takes 45 minutes to render. I mean, obviously it doesn't. It takes 2.5 minutes, but let's just say it takes 45 minutes. But all of a sudden we needed to add a new mat, and we can't re-render this entire scene just so we get these new solid colors for our matte passes. So one thing we do quite often is create a mats layer, and All we want to do is essentially hide or turn off any lighting information that's happening, any reflection, any specular, any of those things that take a long time to render. We just want to shut them down. So here's how I'd set up a mats layer. First, go to global options, and if you're not using displacement maps at all, you can just turn that off. And I'm not. So I'm gonna right click, create layer override, and then turn off. That's another thing, is you can right click on almost anything in the entire scene and create a layer override for it, so that only on this render layer it'll be, switched. So here we go. We've got shadows, create layer override, turn that off. Lights, create layer override, turn that off. I'll leave on default lights just because it helps make the scene run a little quicker. And it's just one directional light. Reflection, refraction, turn that off. Glossy effects, turn that off. Maps, you generally have to leave that on if you're using displacement anywhere. If you're not, you can turn that off too. Filter maps, well, there's no maps, so we don't need to worry about that. Okay, all of the rest of the stuff you want to leave as is, because you want to make sure our AA lines up, our anti-aliasing lines up. GI, we can turn that off entirely. Create layer override, off. Settings, this is usually fine. Oh, let's just do our -3000 trick. We'll use Embry as well. Always use Embry if you can, because it's awesome and goes way faster. Okay, cool. So that is pretty slimmed down. Oh, and then also it's a matte pass only, so you don't need, bump, diffuse, none of these extra texts, lighting. You don't need any of this stuff. So we'll just click it all off. Just have our multi-mats. So now, if we go back over here, I'm just gonna save this image out really quickly. This took 2.5 minutes to render. I'm just gonna hit render again, and you'll see no pre-calculation of GI. It does still a pre-calc for subsurface scatter because there's still SSS in the scene, but that's fine. So now that took 5.2 seconds, and we have our new mats pass. Really, really handy, really useful for, holy crap, I need a mat right now. So what happens if all of a sudden the compositor is like, all right, you're doing great, but I need to get a mat for just this sword. And you're like, well, yo man, you can just construct it from the 2 mats that I already gave you and then just sort of roto it out and do it. No. Compositors are working super fast and super hard also. For the most part, they don't have time to do that. So you need to give them a mat for this thing. So here's what you do. And so it's kind of a tricky situation because we've already got these objects inside of a multi-mat group that's connected to this whole guy. So see that all these objects are already in this Hero 3. So what are we gonna do? So this is where I would break my rule and attach a group. So we've got this dagger as a whole, and I have this dagger group. I'm gonna create a new multi-mat, Vray, object properties, apply single object properties to the dagger group. So here I'd say vrop dagger care or something like that for character, and assign an override here. We'll make this number 6, and now when I render this, we can see that we have our regular material-based multi-mats. We've got our whole multi-mat, and now we also, we also have something that doesn't work when I need it to work. Of course. Okay. So that only works sometimes, and it's the weirdest thing. So here's what I would do in this situation, because that is not working. I would create a new mats group, and the grouping thing, it kind of always uses the lowest level. I should have known this before I started this. It always uses the lowest level. So if you have a group and another group and then your geometry, and your geometry is in a object properties group, it's only going to use the lowest level. So it's only going to use what's in that geometry group. But if you don't have any geometry stacked in anywhere, and you have a group here and another group here, whatever your bottom group that's in an object properties is going to become the one that gets rendered with a mat. So that it kind of makes sense, hopefully, because we put the group in there, but the geometry is lower than the group, so the geometry is getting the multi-mats, but the group isn't. So here, let's just delete that. And here's sort of the backup plan. Create another new multi-mat layer, or another new layer. We'll call this one Mat Extras. Right click, attributes, global. And here's what we start doing. We start making everything in the scene black, and then covering up, or then like making other objects solid red, green, or blue. So this is how we always used to have to do multi-mats until Vray came out and brought that awesome multi-mat architecture to us. So I'm just going to hide all of my lights in the scene. I'm going to hide this one too. And I'm going to create some materials. So I like to use surface shaders for this because they're super fast to render. So surface shader, 2, 3, 4. Make 4 of them. And they're right around here somewhere. There we are. Okay. So surface shaders, we're gonna make them black. We'll just do 1 is black. 4 will be blue. So these up here are solid red, green, and blue values. So let's do that one blue. We'll do this one as green. And we'll do this bottom one as red. Cool. Now we got black, red, green, and blue. So I'm going to select everything in my scene. A nice way to do this is turn all the objects off and then turn on geometry only, which is this sort of baseball diamond looking one. Select all that stuff in the scene so it only selects the geometry and not any weird controllers or anything else that might be in your scene. Right click, assign material to viewport selection. Now everything is black. And then I want to go here, shading, use my default material so I can actually see stuff again. And I'm going to select the components that make up that dagger, and I'm going to give them one of these colors, RG or B. Now I can go in here and make other things red, green, or blue. Like I can take this dagger here, and let's make this green, and we'll take this guy's sword as a whole and make this blue. Oops, is that right? Here, turn off the default material. Shading, use default. All right, cool. So now we got this red, green, and blue sword in there. Okay. And just like we had set up the other mats layer, we're going to set it up the same way here. So I'll do the process one more time. Turn off displacement. Now, again, only turn off displacement if you're not using displacement. If you are using displacement, leave that on for sure. It's going to really matter when you're in compositing. So turn off lights and shadows, turn off reflection, glossy, maps, turn all those off, turn off GI, and turn off all of our render layers that we don't need. Actually, in this situation, we can turn off absolutely all of them because we're actually going to be using the beauty. Okay, so that's that. And we'll just do a quick render. It should render in just a few seconds. And there we go. Now, because we overrode our materials for our characters to be black, they're actually showing up, we're not doing that pre-pass calc first. So now we got our 3 swords. So that's great. Now, what if, for example, you know what, I won't get into that situation because it's a little more complicated. But we'll get to that in maybe another tutorial. Because I don't want this to go on forever. It's already been 45 minutes. All right, so that is kind of how we set those up. And if you go back to your other materials, like everything is still good, but just on that one mats. And you can just duplicate this one. So another thing you can do is like duplicate layer. go back here, matte extra is 1 now, and I can reselect everything in the scene. I can assign that black all over again, and then I can just go in here and like, okay, well we want these 3 bricks to be blue because we're gonna do something with them. I don't know why. Those to be green. This wall sconce, let's make it red. All right, cool. So now we've got a second weird render layer set up, just in case. You never know. And if we go back, we got our swords, we got our mats, we have our main mats, and we have our beauty. So that's kind of how I'd go about setting all that stuff up. Now there is another way that you can set up object IDs on stuff, which I kind of don't recommend because it's hard to find what you did again in the future. But you can also add an object ID instead of with an object properties group like these guys down here. If you select him and go to your shape node, you can then go to attributes, Vray, and add in object ID here. And you can assign any number to this. It works just like this one. But the reason I don't like doing that is because it becomes really hard to find what you're doing. You know, if you had tons of characters and tons of stuff going on in the scene, and you're going in here and like selecting this piece of geometry and being like, okay, this is gonna be number 1, and yeah, this is gonna be number 2, and what if there's like subgroups and sub hierarchies? There's just no easy way to know like what number is that assigned to, or what is this connected to, or what's this doing. It's just kind of a pain in the butt. So I would recommend putting it all right here, nice and easy to read and see and find in your outliner, and you can go in and change the stuff at any time. So that's pretty fun. All right, so that's mats. We got mats all squared away. Let's do environment volume. So let's say we wanted to add fog lights, you know, like God rays and kind of stuff. All right, so this is super fun. I'm gonna go up here, create another new layer, and we'll just call this env fog, environment fog, attributes, global, as always. I'm gonna hide all of my lights because I'm gonna be making a new light for this thing. And let's just twirl this all up. V-Ray sphere light, you can get rid of that too. Actually, I'm just gonna put this in my lights night subfolder. Okay, so what I want to do is put like God rays coming down on our hero. Okay, so first things first, let's create the light. So V-Ray, lights, not V-Ray, and we could just use a spotlight. With this stuff, you can kind of use any light that you want. All the Maya lights work great. Well, that's not true. Spotlight and directional light work great. The other ones I would definitely not use for any reasons ever. Never use an ambient light. Never use a, I mean, you use a point light, but you try not to. Area lights are cool, but you know, obviously they don't work with V-Ray. And volume lights, just don't use those ever. They look terrible. That's not true. I mean, I've used them in the past. I've used them for certain very specific things, but that was before I had V-Ray. So now that you got V-Ray, just don't use them. All right, cool. So we got a spotlight. I'm gonna set the decay rate to linear, and set the temperature up, or the intensity up to maybe like 30ish. Let's give it a kind of a nice bluish hue, a blue hue, which is good. Let's just turn on a little bit of cone angle. Take our penumbra up to 10ish or so. Probably gonna want to go higher on that, and definitely turn on shadows, light radius. Again, like I always said, 0.2 is sunlight size, sunlight radius. Basically at 0, your shadows are going to be perfectly sharp. At 0.2, they're going to start to feather and fade out the further away they get from the object that's casting the shadow, more like sunlight actually does. Or more like all lights really do that, but sunlight's at 0.2. And if we set this up to maybe like a 1, the shadows are going to be pretty soft right off the bat. So like as soon as the shadow leaves that object, it's going to soften way out. And the further away it gets, it's going to be softer and softer. It's great for doing like snowy, soft stuff, or I don't know, just anytime you want like softer shadows. Really handy. So let's just put that up to 1. And we'll go over here. Oop. Oh, right. Gotta turn all objects back on again. Okay, and I'm gonna actually tilt this forward a little. All right, looking good. Then, to actually set up the environment fog, we just go here to render globals, go to Vray, and let's just close all that stuff down. Environment tab. Now that we're on our environment fog render layer, you can right click, create layer override, use environment fog, check that on. Environment shader, we're just gonna click this, and we're gonna look here for Vray, volumetric. And right here we've got our environment fog. And that's the Vray environment fog, the top one. That's one you want to use. Simple fog and scatter fog are kind of nice, but environment fog just does the trick, and it's the fastest. So click that on. And if we click over here, we can actually see our parameters for our environment fog. By default, it really depends on the scene size. So if you have a gigantic scene, you're going to want to increase your distance quite a bit and your height. If you have a really small scene, you can pretty much leave those things at default, and it should look pretty good. So I'm just going to go and turn on IPR render, and we can take a look at how this is all working. So I'm just going to make sure that this doesn't need anything crazy. Yeah, no, I think that should work just fine right off the bat. So IPR and our shot, and we'll see what we get in just a minute. All right, you can already see our scene has good fog in it. I don't know if you can see it in there actually, but let me increase the intensity of this light a lot. There we go. All right, let me actually see if I turn this down. Okay. Okay, cool. So there's that. I'm going to actually reduce the cone angle a little bit. There we go. All right, so that was way too big. So there's our guy in a little bed of fog. And he's super happy. Happy to be there. So let's mess with our fog parameters a little bit. So open that render globals again, go back to the V-Ray tab, environment fog, click over there. You can also actually get it right here in the outliner. It's at the bottom. All right, so our density, we're gonna probably want to decrease that some. So we'll go to 5. Oop, sorry, fog distance. No, that's fine. Let's leave that back at like 20, or maybe like 40. Yeah. Cool. And then our fog density, probably want to decrease this to like maybe 2.5. You can already see it's lighting our character as well and our environment, which is fine for this pass because it's not a big deal. And also I want to turn off the GI. There's no need for GI in this. So right click, layer override, GI goes off. It looks like it might still be doing something. I'm just going to restart this IPR with GI off now. All right. Okay, so that's that. Oops. Let's go back to our V-Ray environment fog. And it's really just a matter of kind of messing with these values until you find the stuff that you're looking for. So do 0.3 again here. We don't really want to scatter the GI because that's crazy. It just takes a long time to render. Okay. I'm gonna sneak this in from an angle, actually. Instead of having it just come straight down on him like that. Cool. Something like that's kind of fun. And another thing that you can always try is scoot that up a little. There we go. All right, we'll do maybe an 11 on the cone angle, just to really like tighten it up around him. So yeah, another thing that you can do that's super fun is to actually, instead of making this a solid color for our light, we're gonna do it as a noise. So I'll grab this color, just make sure that that's stored, and it is. And in color, I'm just gonna plug in a noise. And you're gonna see right off the bat, and I wanna actually reduce all this stuff quite a bit. Take our place 2D and actually go kind of big on this. So we'll do like a 0.3. And you can kind of start to see the breakup inside of the actual fog before it actually hits the character and starts casting his own fog ray shadows or fog light shadows. And if I go in here again and go back to my texture, you can see what that's doing. And I'd love to get a little more black area in there. So I'm just going to keep messing with this until, there we go. Something like that's probably good. Threshold, we can leave that down. Cool. All right, so that's the idea. Ratio, we'll leave that low. Spottiness, that's what I wanted. Spottiness and size randomization is good. All right. So yeah, you see already, like right off the bat, you know, we're getting nice action. So it's kind of like it's breaking through clouds, you know. It's doing some interesting things. So I'm just gonna do a quick render of this real fast, just so we can see it not constantly trying to re-render itself. Oh wait, before I do, escape. I'm gonna add in one extra render element pass. This is gonna be environment. Atmospheric effects. So click this on, add it. This will be the only one we have on for this. I can turn the rest of these all off. Vray atmospheric effects. So now when I do a render here, you'll see why I don't care so much that it's actually casting diffuse light into the scene. Because in this pass, we just get the black and white version of it. And this is perfect for comping on top of stuff. Now you may notice that that looks incredibly grainy. And it looks incredibly grainy for a few reasons. First of all, I've got my threshold set to 0.3. So that's making the whole scene render a little grainier. But I can actually fix that by going to my environment fog. Excuse me. And increasing my subdivs here to something like 128. Environment fog needs a lot of subdivs to resolve beautifully, because it's the entire area of your render that needs to be subdivided. So you can see though already at 128, I mean the render time's gonna be barely longer. It was 7.6 last time, and we're gonna be, I think, at about 13 seconds this time. Just feels like a 14, maybe 18. Okay, 18.6. Okay, so it did essentially over double our render times, but our render times are already so fast. Big deal. Cool, so you can already see how that's working. And then my atmosphere is right there, and that's looking good too. So what I'm gonna do is not do anything with that. That is basically how you set up environment fog. I'll do one more environment fog example with just the direction light also. So we'll just duplicate layer here, environment fog, we'll call this directional, and I'm going to hide my spotlight, and I'm instead going to use a Vray light, directional light. And you know, it's the same kind of thing with this, it's just that this is going to cast into your whole scene. But I would do the same stuff. Light angle set to 1. Color, plug in a noise, mess with the values a lot more spotty, a lot more size randomization, a lot less dense. And if you can see this map, imagine that only the white areas are actually going to be casting a little ray of light down, and everywhere it's black is just going to be in shadow. So you can kind of imagine what this is going to look like. just gonna save this real fast and hit render. All right, this is pretty crazy. You can see why it's pretty crazy, because the scale of my pattern is so small that we're seeing it just looks like rain almost, which is crazy, and I didn't expect that, but that's cool. All right, so I'm gonna take my place 2D texture and I'm gonna repeat it to 0.1 and 0.1, which essentially should just, yeah, make it way bigger. If we do another render really fast, it should start to look a little bit better. Cool. Yeah, so that's the idea. Let's turn our frequency all the way down, and let's just take this one last time, and from 0.1 we'll do 0.01 and 0.01, and do another render here. So it's now just going to be really giant, the occasional like beam coming through. And because it's layering so much, you know, we're still seeing this big fat swath. But this is ideal if you have a giant scene, you know, and you've got a bunch of clouds up there and there's just like little rays of light casting through here and there. That's a really good way to go about it also. You can also, instead of doing it with you know, throwing something into the color, you can just create a shadow plane. This is another thing that I do quite often. If I want shadows in specific places, I'll go here to polygons, create a plane, scale it way up, and add a bunch of divisions into it. So maybe like 50. Okay. And then just go in here and like look through the sort of the eye of my light and be like, all right, so I'm gonna grab faces and I'm gonna start cutting some holes. So I'd love to see light hitting those guys. Let's add a little more light here and here. And you know, I'm kind of like looking in the same direction of the light. So this is how the light would pass through. So I'm just gonna keep on deleting a few of these, and it'll make sense in a little bit once I finally. And you can be a little, you know, a little sporadic around here. Have some fun with it. I want to light that character. I want to get a little light on this guy and this hand. So you can kind of see what I'm doing here. I'm punching little holes that light's going to penetrate through and cast God rays for. Right on. And with this thing still selected, we want to make sure that it is not primary visibility on. And you see, because I'm on this render layer, primary visibility is going to automatically enable as an override. We don't want to see it in reflections or refractions, and we don't need it to receive any shadows, just cast shadows. So we go down here and do another render of this scene. Now our light, our sunlight, is still full on. There's no more noise on that anymore. Now let's see what this gives us. So here I've selected the areas that I want to have with God rays on them. You know, I wanted to get his hand, and I wanted it, you know, a little bit on his head. I wanted this guy to get hit a little bit with it. So that's another way to go about it. So it really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So that's how you set up that stuff. Pretty fun. There's our other one, and you'll see. Okay, so this is another thing that's kind of annoying with render layers, is because I made the directional light while I was on this render layer. If I go back to my fog light render layer, that directional light is still on. So if I were to render this pass now, which was working beautifully just a minute ago, it's gonna look like crap, because we have a full directional light now casting a bunch of light into the scene, as well as our single light there. So anytime you add new stuff to the scene, go back to the master layer and hide it on that master layer. And we'll hide the spotlight also. And what's this? Oh, the scones. Yeah, that's fine. Then I'm going to go back to my fog light and unhide it there. I'm gonna go back to my directional version and unhide that one there. Just really helpful for quickly jumping back and forth between these render layers and actually getting something that, you know, sticks to what we want it to stick to. Okay, so that's that. Object properties, groups, displacement. Okay, so here's a few other really useful passes that compositors are always asking me for. And it's called UV passes and world position passes, and there's just some general noise passes that they can use. So we'll go back into our globals and add in an extra text. Extra text is pretty much like your go-to pass whenever you want to add an overall color or utility style thing to it. So this extra text, I'm going to twirl down this and add in a texture of a ramp. And so just go texture, ramp. And actually, that is not what I want to do. Here's what I'm going to do instead. Let's just clear all this silliness. And we'll go to ramp, RAM. Get a ramp in there, and then sampler info node. Sampler info node is kind of like the super duper go-to awesome node for everything. You know what? What am I thinking? We don't need a sampler info. What am I doing? We're just doing a good old-fashioned UV texture. Okay, so what you want to do is delete either one of these. You just want one. So we'll delete that one. And then we can delete all these connections to it, but we definitely want to keep this 2D placement node. And I'm going to hold down shift, middle click, and drag from the place 2D to the ramp. And what we want to do is connect the out UV coordinates into the ramps, our only black color. We want to connect into the R and the G channel, so the red and green channel. So if we go here to the out UV, we'll take our out U and our out V, and then go to UV coordinates. Oh, sorry. Go to color entry list 0, which is our black one. This is our color entry list 0. If I add more of these, you'll see color entry list 1, color entry list 2, etc. So we want a 0, and we want the 0 color, which is our selected color here. And we're going to do U into R and V into G. And I'm sure you guys have probably seen this before. This is essentially a UV ramp that we can use to re-UV things inside of compositing. Okay, so now we've got that ramp set up. Go back to our extra text, and I'm just going to middle click and drag that right into our texture. And we'll call this our ramp UV. Super handy. Okay, so that's a UV pass, and we can actually rename this up here to, I always do like ET for extra text, and then UV. And down here, what it's going to do is say extra text, and then it's going to do underscore ramp UV. So whatever the name of our ramp is. So that should be fine. And let's also add a world position pass, and that's going to use our sampler info. So again, extra text, add. That's good. And we'll just put our sampler info in here. And then we're also going to want to add a ramp. So just like before, another ramp. And we'll get rid of this because we're not going to need it. Get rid of one of these colors. And, you know, a ramp without an actual, like, 2 colors is just a color. It's just a solid color you can put anything into. So I'm going to shift click and drag this over here. Shift middle click and drag. And we're going to take our point world, X, Y, and Z, and plug it into our color entry list, color RGB. So point X becomes R, point Y becomes G, and point Z becomes B. Okay, so now this is our world PPP for world particle position pass, or point position pass, sorry. And that's really helpful for nuke compositors because it gives them a more accurate 3D position representation of the scene in their compositing program. So we'll add another extra text here. Boom, number 3, and I'm going to click and drag this world PPP in there. Middle click and drag. So those are those two guys. And lastly, we're going to set up a few cool matte ideas. Or not matte IDs, but matte ideas. Ideas. All right, so compositors like to work with a few extra noisy passes and fractal passes and stuff like that. So we'll throw in a Brownian, a solid fractal, and a marble. And we'll do a granite and a granite. All right. So you don't really have to go too crazy with these. I'm going to make them all black and white value versions of themselves. Something like theirs. Oh, actually, yeah, I'll actually boost that one so my background color is still black. For the marble, let's just make it black and white also. That's, I don't know, just mess with these. It doesn't really matter what you do with these. They're just interesting passes that they can hopefully like kiss in here and there if they want to grunge things up. Solid fractal is fine. So there's a few ways you can do this. One is I could make 4 new extra texts for all these. But because these are all black and white maps, they're all going to be using the black and white colors of them in the first place. I'm going to actually go ahead and make another extra text, just one. And I'm going to plug in these values into the texture's input color. Well, okay, that's one way to go, but let's make it all self-contained. We'll do another ramp. And delete this. And scoot this over here. Delete one of our colors. So we just got this black one. And middle click and drag over here. And I'm going to take the out color. Again, this is a black and white image, so we just need RGB. Or RGB are all the same. I'm going to output R into the color entry list, color entry, color into the R here. Then I'm going to take the solid fractal and load that one. I'm going to output R into G. I'm going to take the marble and load that one and output my R into B. So you're like, what the hell? I just created some mess, just a total noisy, disgusting mess. And then I'm just going to middle click and drag our new ramp, and this will just be called ramp noises. Cool. Oops. So this ramp noises is going to be used mainly for here, I'll just show you. I'll do another render real fast now that we set up these extra crazy passes. So I'll go over here, and our mat should look, oops, there we go. Our mat should look pretty much just like our master layer should look like our beauty, so I'm not gonna bother rendering on our master layer, or on our beauty rather. Okay, so we'll get this going, do another quick render here. And let me just click on our bucket viewer. Okay, so we start to scroll down, and we'll start to see some of these new maps we just added. So here we've got our ramp UV. So this is a UV pass, and in compositing, there's actually a plugin called RE Map by Revision Effects. And Nuke has another one. It's just called UV Chooser and Stamp. I think it's Stamp. Yeah. That, you know, you can then take any 2D texture you've got, like any flat, regular old 2D texture you've got, and use these coordinates to pop that texture back on top. And if you're doing what they call a back to beauty build inside of Nuke, which is taking the beauty and then extracting out the diffuse, the raw reflection, refraction, all that stuff, and then compiling it all back together to create the beauty again. This makes, I mean, your life becomes really, really easy when you're in here, because you can just say, okay, I want, you know, this rock to have this new texture inside a Nuke. And you don't have to wait. You have to go back to the 3D guy and have him re-render a whole new pass for you. You can just do it right here inside a Nuke. Really great for doing like screens on you know, tablets or, you know, phones, stuff like that, because that content is always changing up to the last second, and instead of having to re-render the scene over and over and over again, just kick out a UV pass, and then you can throw that new screen content you get from the client right on top in your compositing program, whether it be After Effects or Nuke or Photoshop even. So that's super fun. This extra text, what is this one? I don't know, but it's all black. We have a black extra text here. Oh, right. I guess I made one. I forgot to fill it with something. Let's remove that guy. Our world PPP. Now, this doesn't make any sense at all in terms of what this image looks like. But when you bring it into Nuke and classify it as a world particle pass or position pass, it'll make total sense. And then here's our noises. And obviously this looks terrible, but if you just look at the R channel alone, there's one of our noise patterns. If you just look at the G channel, it's a different noise pattern we've got. And if you just grab the blue channel, here's our crazy marble noise pattern. And you can keep messing with these. You can add a bunch. You know, you just throw like 3 or 4 extra render layers in there with just different noise values. And then compositing can like kiss those in here and there if they need to. And because they're all black and white anyway, you know, you can more optimize and use your channel instead of having to create a bunch of extra channels for them. So that is kind of how that works. And I think that was the last thing we added. Yeah, ramps. Okay. So, all right, the very last thing I'm going to talk about in this series here, or this whatever it is adding new objects and matting them appropriately inside of your scene. So let's create another render layer. Attributes, global. And we'll call this new ball. Okay, so let's say, for example, everything's working great, but they're like, oh crap, we need to add in this ball. It's got to be right in the center of the scene, and we don't have time to re-render the entire scene. But it needs to be occluded by things, it needs to be cut out and matted all correctly. What do we do? So here's how you solve that. So let's just create a ball. Create polygon sphere. And let's just say that it's like here, right? And they're like, that's where the ball needs to be, but it needs to cut out by the fur and, you know, by this character, and needs to be affected by GI and lighting in the scene and all this. You know, it has to look like it was rendered in that scene from the start. So we'll create a new material, a Vray material, and we'll make this kind of something that stands out. We'll make it like bright red and reflective and all that fun stuff. So it's 0.8 maybe. Okay. So we need this ball rendered alone. I'm going to create an object properties group for it. Vray object properties, single object. Call this vrop ball. Cool. And then we have everything in the scene loaded into these object properties groups already. If we didn't, you would just take everything in the scene and put it in any object properties group, a blank one. But now that we're on our new ball render layer, I'm just going to go in and make sure that none of these things render visibly, but they all still interact with the ball. So I'm going to go here to my enemy. I'm going to turn on, I'm just going to override all this stuff. Override matte surface and turn that on. Alpha contribution, you want this to go to -1. Generate earn elements, you can turn that off. Affect shadows and affect alpha, you can turn those on. And then we just want to turn off all of these. We want all these values to be set to 0. Boom, 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 boom. That way it's not receiving any GI, or it's not like going to be showing any GI in the render, any reflections, refractions, any of that stuff. All this stuff isn't going to show up in the render, but it's still going to calculate for the ball's sake. So we'll do the same thing for our enemy number 2. Matte surface, check on alpha contribution, -1. Generate render elements, turn that off. Turn on our 2 shadows. We just basically want to toggle all this stuff here. So let's create some more render layers, layer overrides, layer override, layer override. Turn this all off. Do for enemy 3. So that is the only unfortunate thing, is depending on how many of these object properties groups will determine how many times you have to repeat yourself on this process. And I'm just going to keep on adding these things. Bingo. Object properties heroes. Turn him off. Turn our alpha contribution -1. We don't want to generate any rel elements, but we still want to cast shadows. We want to affect the alpha of our sphere. Turn all this stuff off. Bing, bing, bing. Okay, and finally our grass. Like that, this, that, toggle. Each one of these, and 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay. And our ball should everything be on. Everything should just be on. So now when we go in here and render our new red ball, if I just save this really fast, it's still going to calculate all the GI in the scene. It's still going to calculate all the reflections. All that stuff is still, and that's why we're seeing it here. But then when it goes to actually the full render, should just render the ball. Oh, I guess I forgot. I don't have this in an object properties group. Of course I don't. But, you know, you can see what would have happened if I had that back stuff in an object properties group. And you can see in the alpha, it's only bringing up the alpha of the ball and, of course, this back wall. Let me actually go ahead and throw that wall into an object properties group of its own. So I'm just going to go up here, turn off my all objects, turn on just the polygon selection like this, and create Vray object properties, single object properties, and we'll call this Vrop wall. Okay, and we're still on our new ball render layer. So I'm gonna do the same thing right here. Matte -1, generate yes on those. Oops, create, override, boom, boom, all zeroed. Okay, let's try that one more time. And because I've created all these things as an override, they'll only be toggled the way that I have them now on that new ball layer. So if I switch different layers, the overrides will shut down and it'll go back to, you know, working the same way it was before. And there we go. Now we've got our ball totally separate. We can composite that in. All of our render elements are great for it. It's ready to go. So we can drop that right into our scene that looks like this otherwise. Okay, and that is how you set up map passes of just the thing. Now, of course, the other way you can do that is, you know, you can render the entire scene and then have the ball rendered with like a red matte that you can extract and then color correct. But this is for if, you know, your scene took way too long to render, you don't want to re-render the entire scene again. You just want to add this new thing in and have it look and feel like it's part of the scene. That's how you would do that. Okay. I think that pretty much wraps it up for me for this series, for just like setting up render layers, mattes, elements, all that fun stuff. This is how you do it. I hope it's been helpful, and thanks for sticking around. Thanks for watching, and I'm gonna put these all up on my YouTube channel, so feel free to go there. And I've got tons of other tutorials for Maya and Vray and lighting and rendering and all that stuff. And I'm gonna be adding to that like crazy. I just started a few days ago, so I will be putting a lot of stuff together over the next couple of weeks. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you guys next time. All right.